Welcome to the Inner West Urban Ecology Spring and Nature Engagements. Today we are celebrating our urban frogs. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I would like to ask my colleague Nicole Gallahar from the Urban Ecology team to join us for this interview.
Thanks, Pilar. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a Senior Volunteers and Projects Officer in the Urban Ecology team, and my role is to develop citizen science programs in the Inner West. Today, we welcome Dr. Jodi Rowley from the Australian Museum in conversation about the frogs of the Inner West. Dr. Jodi Rowley is a biologist with a focus on amphibian diversity, ecology, and conservation, and a passion for communicating biodiversity conservation. She is Curator of Amphibians at the Australian Museum Research Institute in Sydney and the Chief Scientist of Frog ID, the Australian Museum's flagship citizen science project. Her research seeks to uncover and document biodiversity, understand its drivers, and inform conservation decisions. She focuses on amphibians because they have the greatest levels of undocumented diversity of any terrestrial vertebrate group, perform irreplaceable functions in many ecosystems, and are being lost at an unprecedented rate. Hi Jodi, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I thought I'd start with a little introduction to our citizen science program. Last year in spring we ran a program called Inner West After Dark. This program was focused on surveying frogs and microbats in our wetlands. We ran 4 community events at Whites Creek and Tempe wetlands and introduced participants to frogs and how they record them using the Frog ID app, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. The people who came along were really amazed to see our natural areas, especially at night, and to connect with our wildlife. The enthusiasm of everyone, young and old, was really quite infectious, and it made me realise just how important citizen science programs are to educate people, to collect useful data, and to foster this enthusiasm about wildlife. So I'm really excited to have you with us today, Jodi. Everyone at our events loved frogs, so I'd like to ask you, what fascinates you about frogs and why are frogs so important?
Well, I fell in love with frogs pretty late in life. I grew up in Sydney. I grew up in the city, actually. Surrey Hills was where I spent the first years of my life. So, really in the thick of kind of urban Sydney, and I wasn't super connected to nature. So, it wasn't until I went out into a stream at night at university. So, once I was 18, so I missed out on a lot of the sort of childhood frog connections that so many people do get. And I just fell in love with frogs as just, these amazing creatures, topaz eyeballs, they look so precious and vulnerable. And at the same time, realizing how much trouble frogs were in, both within Australia and globally, it sort of became a bit of a mission to do what I can to help save them. And they really are an important part of ecosystems, even within our urban environments. So we really do need frogs around, and it's so great that we do have frogs still around in the inner west and throughout Sydney.
Absolutely. I'm thinking back to my memories of frogs now that you've mentioned it, and I remember that the first frog I learnt to identify was Limnodonastes peronii, the striped marsh frog, which many inner Westies will be familiar with. I was surveying frogs in ponds in Mount Annan Gardens, which is a bit further west of here, in the dark. And at first, all I could hear was this great chorus of sounds from 8 different species. And I thought, oh, I never learned to tell these apart. And then I heard the sound of a tennis ball being hit by a racket. The very unusual and distinctive call of the striped marsh frog. And I was so excited that I could actually tell one of them apart. And ever since then, I've been a little bit obsessed about listening out for frogs. And I wanted to ask you, what's your most memorable frog experience in an urban area?
Wow, actually, I guess there's two. One,
Yeah.
I live in pretty urban Sydney myself, but not that far away. Probably about a
Uh-huh.
5 minute drive is a little patch of urban bushland, and it's not huge. It's surrounded by houses, but we're lucky enough to have red-crowned toadlets, and
Ah,
they are gorgeous, tiny little frogs, only about 2 centimeters big. They're usually a grayish color, but they have this spectacular, as the name implies, red sort of crown on their head, sort of a little red patch, and a little red patch just on their rear end as well. And they spend most
yeah.
of their time underneath the leaf litter, making a little sort of squelchy noise when they call. But most people just don't know that they're there. And I remember I went walking with my dad only a couple of years ago in this patch of bushland. It was sprinkling with rain, and you know how beautiful it is when it's sort of that. And I heard these frogs, and
Mm,
I managed to just lift up some leaves, and there was this red-crowned toadlet. And my dad, who had lived in the area for decades, had never
yeah.
realised that there was this amazing precious wildlife right under his feet almost. And he actually started crying because of this. He just didn't realise there was something so special living right near him. And I think that's, like you were mentioning at the beginning, it's that connection with nature that sometimes we don't
Yeah.
have. And whether it's citizen science or partaking on, bushwalk groups, or even community gardening, just that interaction with the nature in whatever form is so important for us to be able to care and then hopefully protect our wild friends.
Yeah, that's a wonderful experience, and I've actually never seen those frogs, but I have heard about them. And I totally agree with you. I'm coming to thinking more and more that we need to nurture that love for the environment, you know. So in order to promote conservation, it's really important. Um,
Yeah,
right.
definitely. And
So
and yeah, as kids we have
yeah.
that and we tend to lose it.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right, we do. And we had quite a few children on some of our events and they were so excited, you know. At our events we used the wonderful Frog ID app developed by your team at the Australian Museum, and it was used to engage the community and train people to record frogs, not only for the Inner West but also to contribute to the Australia-wide Frog ID program. And we found the app was really fun and easy to use. And one of the things that people love about it is that the calls they record are identified by an expert. And I guess they feel like they can join in. They don't need to know how to ID frogs, but then they can learn, you know, as they go. So I was wondering, where did the idea for Frog ID come from? And tell us maybe a bit more about that program for people who don't know a lot about it.
All right. Well, I guess probably about 4 years, or actually, it's probably more like 5 years ago, I was actually having a chat with the director of the Australian Museum, Kim McKay, and I was telling her that every species of frog has a different call, and that so you don't need to see a frog, you just need to listen to it. And she kind of joked, "Oh, there should be a frog Shazam." And it was basically just that conversation that she then went ahead and decided that, right, this was going to be a flagship citizen science project of the Australian Museum. And if it was just up to me, I wouldn't know where to start. It's been such a whirlwind, and we've had Frog ID running almost 3 years. So I guess the premise behind it is
Mm,
that we don't know that much about frogs. We still don't know how many
yeah.
species we have in Australia. We don't know where they are, where they're distributed, and we really need to help frogs out, figure out what species and places need our help the most. So we urgently need data. We need to know what's going on. And
Mm,
there's not enough frog biologists like myself out there. We really need everybody to help. And in the last 3 years, like a lot of people have helped. It's been really amazing. And we've got almost
mm.
250,000 records of frogs from across Australia in less than 3 years, which is
Wow.
absolutely astounding. And it's a game changer, both in terms of all the information that we have, and then the results that we're able to understand. For example, like the early impacts of bushfires, we're able to understand how frogs are coping with urban environments, and all these things just using frog ID records. But it also is putting people a little more in touch with the frogs of their local areas, which I think is actually probably it's just as important. It's really easy to step over something and not care unless you look a little closer, listen a little harder, and the app is I guess trying to make it as easy as possible. You don't need to add your location. You don't, that's automatic. You don't need your time, your
Yeah.
date, all these kind of things that take extra effort. And you don't need to know what the frog is. All you do is press record for 20 to 60 seconds. The call gets uploaded. One of the team at the Australian Museum, the Frog ID team, listens to those recordings, identifies the frogs, and then they form part of this national database. I always found that's an obstacle to me for I want to contribute to bird projects, citizen science projects like eBird, but I don't know anything basically aside from kookaburras and the really obvious birds. So I see a brown bird and I'm done for. So it really is, it's trying to make it as easy as possible to contribute really, scientifically excellent data. You don't need to know what it is. You don't have to worry about making a mistake. It will be listened to by an expert. And, we do have interactions with a lot of people. People ask questions and we tell them, we get people recording insects because there are a lot of insects that sound a lot like frogs, and having that backwards and forwards
Yeah.
with people also connects us with the community as well.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's exactly what you've said. That's what our community members found were the benefits of the app, and they enjoyed using it. Even my mum is she's quite shy about these things, but she's out there using it because she feels confident with it. So yeah, it's really great. It's an amazing achievement. So we in Inner West Council we have 4 species of frogs: striped marsh frog, Perrin's tree frog, dwarf eastern tree frog, and common eastern froglet. Maybe a few more that we haven't recorded. One of my favourite frog calls is made by Latoria perenni, the Perrin's tree frog, and some people say its call sounds like crazy laughing, but I think it sounds like a sheep actually. And it's got 2 parts to its call, and that first little bit I always think of it as the sheepfrog.
Actually,
It's
you're
just
right. They do, yeah.
yeah. And it's actually really amazing sometimes at dusk after we've had rain, and it can be almost deafening when they all get going. But the thing that fascinates me, and it did from the time I started working in West Council on this project, is how can these species thrive in such an urban area? I find it extraordinary.
Yeah, it is. It's really fantastic that we do have frogs still. So obviously the frogs that remain are a subset of the frogs that would have been there, centuries ago or even decades ago. They tend to be
Yeah.
the more tolerant frogs in urban environments. So the frogs that don't
Okay.
mind the small permanent backyard ponds that most people have. So that's, I guess, one of the things is that, one of the findings we got from Frog ID was that green tree frogs, for example, they used to be in the inner west. They used to be all through Sydney. These sort of big, iconic, the Aussie green tree frogs, the size of the palm of your hand, and they've disappeared. And probably the reason we think is because we humans don't particularly like the kind of messy, flooded, kind of grassy areas and things that they might like to breed in. And we do tend to build habitat for like specific frog species. So the striped marsh frog is the prime example. So that tennis ball being hit that you hear in most people across Sydney and a lot, really across much of Eastern Australia's backyard ponds or dams, they've actually probably really benefited from urban areas, and they love the kind of ponds that we build. And the other frogs also don't mind those kind of habitats, but it is fantastic that even within such modified habitats that we still do get good frogs. Certainly having frogs is way better than not having frogs. And then I think we're hoping to learning from Frog ID as well of which suburban and urban habitats support the greatest frog diversity. How do you create habitat for frogs that aren't your main 4 or things like that as well? And so gradually we might be able to get a better understanding of how to support more frog diversity in urban areas.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a real bonus from the Frog ID app, I think. Now, I was going to ask you, we know that frogs can be indicators of environmental health, and the community members often say to us, they've got sensitive skin and they can tell us a bit about the environment. What do you think frogs tell us about our local environment, I guess, in Inner West Council?
Well, it's great that frogs are there for sure. So,
Yeah.
like you said, frogs are very sensitive to any kind of environmental change, and that can be, different kinds of breeding habitat. So, if you remove the kind of exact breeding habitat that they like, then they won't be able to persist. But also, if there's chemicals and things. So, if you have frogs in your backyard or in your local wetlands, that is a definite good sign about environmental
Mm-hmm.
health in your region. Obviously, the more species you have and the more kind of sensitive species you have, the better. But any frog is definitely a good frog to have in your local area.
That's good news for, for us. um, so, following on from that, in highly urbanised areas like the inner west, people's backyards do provide important habitat for our wildlife. And even small changes like planting native shrubs or providing some water for birds can make a big difference, actually. So I was wondering if you could tell us, what are your tips for encouraging frogs into our backyards? How do we provide good habitat for them?
That's a great question. So I guess the obvious thing is a frog pond. And you might
Mm-hmm.
want to get creative about that too. So, because you've got at least two tree frogs, you can also do things like elevated ponds, like bathtubs and things, make really great tree frog habitat. So, having
Ah.
different kinds of habitat. The striped marsh frog can't climb up into bathtubs, so you can give a little bit of variety and some less competition for your good old parents' tree frog by giving them a little bit of a different habitat, maybe because they've got toe pads and can climb up things. But if you're not
Ah.
keen on having a frog pond, or your garden doesn't have that much room, or you don't want frogs necessarily calling outside your bedroom window, which can be an issue in urban areas unless you love frogs like me, then
Yeah.
just making sure that your garden is a bit more frog friendly in terms of no pesticides and chemicals, providing shelter
Mm-hmm.
places for frogs. So frogs can move a kilometre in one night. You wouldn't think it, but you probably have frogs
Oh.
moving through your backyards, even if they're not hanging out by your pond. So if you can provide an area that, that there's like bushes and things around that the frogs might be able to hide in, that's fantastic. Making sure your
Mm-hmm.
cat's inside at night, or preferably all the time, so it doesn't eat all your local frogs that hop into your garden. And even
Yeah.
thinking about things, and it's just like a great activity for kids, is to make tree frog apartment blocks, which are sort of PVC pipes that you can bury standing up straight in the ground. You kind of bury about 30 centimeters of it, and tree frogs will
Mm-hmm.
actually hide inside these pipes during the day, and that's sort of a safe, dark and moist place for them to hide out in the day and not dry out or get eaten by things. So there's lots of great videos about making tree frog apartments as well, which is just a simple PVC pipe. You can decorate it, make it look really pretty, all those kind of things. But there's lots of little things that you can do to make your garden more friendly to frogs and wildlife in general.
That's fantastic. They're really good tips. I like the apartment idea for tree frogs, and I never thought of putting in bathtubs as well. That's really cool, and sort of also then giving both different species of frogs different options in your backyard.
Yeah,
Super.
exactly. Yeah, and local
Yeah.
creeks as well, like a little bit outside from, if you've got any local creeks, they support a whole different diversity of frogs. So one frog, the
Mm.
leaf green tree frog, Latoria philocroa, is actually throughout quite a bit of urban Sydney, which is really surprising. Even some drains and things, as long as there's some vegetation along the side of it. So making sure that your local creeks are healthy supports a whole different set of frogs that you would get in your backyard pond as well.
Mm. Yeah, that's really that's really good. I'm I'm pleased you brought those things up. It's good advice. Now, I am constantly surprised by frogs. Earlier in the year, after the bushfires, we had a lot of rain, and puddles started forming on our grassy areas. And as if from nowhere, striped marsh frogs could be heard calling. And I have no idea where they came from. There were no wetlands nearby, but they were calling in quite large numbers. Some were even calling from building site trenches full of water. But now that you've actually mentioned that 1 kilometre, which I didn't know about, I'm wondering if that's how they got there. But at any rate, they're extraordinary and sort of, for me, unpredictable animals. So my last question for you today, Jodi, is what is one amazing thing that we probably don't know about frogs?
so that they can move. Some frogs don't though. Some frogs will probably move only a meter in their whole life. So it really
Right.
depends on the species. I think how long frogs can live. So most people think
Oh.
because they're small that they would
Mm,
only live for a year or two. You know, there's this kind of a bit like insects. Not that they
yeah.
can't live a while as well, but green tree frogs, for example, can live more than 35 years. And so
Oh,
it is remarkable
wow.
how long some frog species can live. Probably a lot of them don't. So the common eastern froglet or tiny little frogs like that, they might not live more than 5 or 10 years even, or maybe even less in the wild. But certainly in captivity, frogs can live a really long time. And it's quite clear that some of those enormous frogs that we see, like the green tree frogs in the outback toilets,
Mm.
they are probably, teenagers at least.
Oh, that is amazing actually. I wouldn't have guessed 35 years. That's pretty good going, isn't it? Wow.
Yeah, it's fantastic for a little frog.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, that brings us towards the end of our podcast today. Thank you so much for being with us, Jodi. You've given us some amazing insights into the world of frogs and tips and things we didn't know. I really appreciate you coming along today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, and thank you to everyone for listening today. Please explore the citizen science web pages on the Inner West Council website to see how you can get involved. We also have web pages on gardens and wildlife that give you more tips for making your backyard wildlife friendly and frog friendly. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, some of our face-to-face programs are not running in 2020, but there are still many opportunities to monitor frogs, especially with upcoming Frog ID and Frog ID Week, and birds and other wildlife. So keep an eye out for our upcoming digital content through the Inner West What's On and social media channels. Thank you and bye for now.